Have you ever heard of a man who found a lion dying in the mud and decided to save him? David, an old man living alone in Brighton, stumbled upon a wounded lion he named Leo. With no fear and a lot of love, David brought Leo back to life. But what started as a rescue turned into a bond deeper than anything you can imagine. When danger came knocking in the form of a vicious dog, Leo became more than just a friend. He became David's protector. This is a story of second chances, the healing power of love, and the wild spirit that refuses to give up. Do you believe that a single moment can change everything, that life can turn upside down, with a single glance, a gesture, a roar? Prepare yourself, because what you are about to hear is not just a story, it is an experience, a true story that defies the impossible. A man on the verge of oblivion and a dying lion, both abandoned by the world, broken, without hope, until the moment their paths crossed. What happened next defied all logic. He saved him from death, from pain, from loneliness and cruelty. He fed him, cared for him, cured him, but no one could have imagined that the lion would one day return to give something back, not with words but with his claws, his heart, and all the love an animal can feel for a human being. David was 54 years old and lived in Brighton, a coastal town in England. Since the death of his wife, his life had become a soulless routine. Every morning, he woke up to the cry of seagulls, tended his garden, ate in silence, and fell asleep with his eyes fixed on the ceiling, flooded with memories. He was a good but broken man. His wife Maria had died in a car accident 7 years earlier. Since that day, David was no longer the same. He had closed his workshop, sold his tools, kept only the house, a piece of land, and an old wooden reindeer, barely used. His world had become silent and gray. He had no children, and his friends had drifted away. Over time, one morning, while he was looking for dry wood for fur in the forest, he heard a strange noise, a deep, harsh growl, almost a moan. He first thought it was an injured dog, but as he sank into the bushes, he stopped dead there, in the middle of the mud. Lying a dirty lion covered in ticks, a twisted doe, a wounded blow. His sunken eyes glowed faintly. He had one breath left. He was close to death. David stepped back. In disbelief, a lion in England, he thought. It had escaped from an illegal circus. But it wasn't the time to ask questions. The animal was struggling to breathe, and even though David knew nothing about wild cats, he recognized in that look the look of a living being that would die without help. He ran home, grabbed a soda, some raw meat, an old blanket from the freezer. His heart pounding, he returned to the spot. The lion barely moved, but at the smell of meat, he tried to eat. David approached slowly, reached out and waited. The lion accepted the food, drank a little water, then laid its head on the ground. David clearly saw the wounds, a scar, an open protruding rib. Someone must have chained it up, used it for entertainment. Then, abandoning him that night, David set up a makeshift shelter in his shed. He laid the animal on straw, cleaned his wounds with saline solution, and spoke to him. Yes, he spoke to him like a child. I don't know where you came from or why you're here, but now you're safe, you hear me, safe. He called him Leo because in his weakened eyes slumbered a force like a storm. The first days were difficult. Leo vomited and barely moved. David fed him with a syringe, gave him fluids, played soft music, woke up every 2 hours to check if he was still breathing, and little by little, Leo began to react. First, he raised his head, then took a few steps and finally learned to recognize David's hand as a sign of gratitude. For many, this would have been a miracle. For David, it was the first time in years that his heart was beating again, for something. Winter passed, spring arrived, and with it life. Flowers opened, and Leo began to run, play with branches, and let out little roars. David called them cat laughs. The young lion was already showing the beginnings of his future power. David built him a small habitat with recycled materials, a fence, a plastic bowl, rugs, and a rope to play with. Leo adapted as if he had been born there, and David began to smile again. They became inseparable. They walked together in the forest, slept side by side, and on silent nights, Leo's purring could be heard all the way home. One evening, while he was stroking his friend David's budding mane, David whispered, "I never thought I'd be able to get up, but you saved me." He didn't know how right he was. Months passed, and what had started as a simple gesture of compassion had turned into something much greater. Leo's mane was growing fast, his shoulders were becoming massive, and his paws were leaving deep prints in the garden's soil. But what impressed David most was Leo's nature. He wasn't a wild animal, at least not with him. He showed no aggression. He never growled. He was tender, almost playful. He sniffed gently. David licked his face and snuggled up to him like a giant dog, stayed by his side during breakfast, accompanied him when he chopped wood, watched him while he harvested plants. David had rediscovered a taste for life. He sang while cooking, talked to himself, or at random, and no longer felt alone. Every morning he would say, "Come on, today we still have a lot to do," and the lion followed him, faithful like a dog. The story of this unlikely duo began to circulate. One day, a young neighbor filmed David and Leo from afar and then posted the video online. It went viral. A man lives with a lion in his garden. Reactions were mixed: shock, wonder, and emotion. A local animal protection association learned of it. At first, they wanted to withdraw the charge, but after an investigation into his health, his behavior, and his bond with David, they made an exceptional decision. Leo could remain under strict conditions with regular checks and security measures. The shed was transformed into a suitable enclosure. Cameras were installed. A reinforced fence was erected. Climbing structures and toys were added. Leo now had his refuge, but he always stayed close to David. What was once an ordinary house became a sanctuary. Soon, visitors arrived. First neighbors, then friends, and finally families. The area was home to sick children, adults, depressed or in the grip of anxiety. David never asked for money, only for respect, and the gentle giant, let himself be petted, leaned calmly against people who often burst into tears. There was something restorative in his gaze. A journalist wrote, "He's not a trained lion, he's a grateful lion." David found a new meaning in this mission. He was no longer the broken man he once was. But life doesn't stop. One evening while he was gathering wood in the forest, he heard a whimper between rusty wires. A wounded pit bull lay emaciated and bloody, his fur covered in scars, probably a victim of an illegal dog fight. David didn't hesitate. He carried him home, treated his wounds, fed him, and called him Max. But Max was different. While Leo showed affection, Max remained distant. He ate without looking, slept apart, and refused to be petted. When Leo approached, Max didn't growl loudly, but with increasing intensity. David noticed, but he didn't give up. He spoke to him gently, showed him pictures of his deceased wife, and told him stories. "No one will hurt you. Here. You came to heal like Leo." The days became more tense. David felt the pressure. Max ate, but his gaze was wary. David slept poorly, often with one eye open. One day, he caught Max staring at him, frozen for a long time, as if assessing him. Leo remained calm, observing Max without intervening, but in his eyes, a silent vigilance shone. One day, a visiting child asked, "Aren't you afraid of living with a lion?" David smiled, looked at Leo lying in the sun and replied, "What scares me isn't what roars, it's what is silent and waits for the moment." He didn't know how right he was. The following days were stifling, an unusual heat for spring. David had slept poorly. A recurring dream haunted him. A roar, a shadow, a fall. Early in the morning, he picked vegetables as usual. He said hello to Leo, who was peacefully drifting off under a tree. But Max was nowhere to be found. David found him near the fence, chewing, his gaze fixed as he approached. Max looked up into his eyes. There was no fear, but something else, something dark, something elusive. "What do you have there, big boy?" David asked. A deep, dry growl. David stopped abruptly. He backed away, not wanting to provoke the dog. The rest of the day passed, but a feeling of unease persisted when evening came. David sat on the veranda, drank a sip of lemonade, and tried to relax. Leo was sleeping nearby, his torso slowly rising. Max remained invisible to him. The birds gradually died down. The sun was low, casting long shadows. David felt like the air was charged, heavy, almost electric, a crackling like before a storm. And then evening came. It happened in a few seconds. A crackle behind the house. Claws on the ground. A guttural growl. David was about to turn when a good one emerged from the shadows, Max right for his throat. The glass he was holding crashed to the ground. With a crash, the rocking chair tipped over. David tried to protect his face with his arm, but Max's teeth were already sinking deep into his forearm. The pain struck him. Max shook his head like a wild animal, tearing flesh from his shoulder. David screamed, trying to free himself. He hit with his free hand, kicked, and finally fell to the ground. Max didn't let go. Instead, he now aimed for his throat. At that moment, David felt death closer than ever. A roar tore through the air. A roar that froze even Max. It was Leo. He ran like a storm, his paws pounding the ground, his mane flying, his eyes shining with fire. In one leap, he lunged at Max, throwing him violently against the garden fence. The dog rolled to the ground, tried to get up, but Leo was faster. With his powerful paws, he pinned Max to the ground. His roar made the air vibrate. David, bleeding, dragged himself to the veranda. With a trembling hand, he grabbed his phone and dialed the emergency number. While waiting for help, Leo remained motionless above Max, a living guardian. He didn't bite, he didn't kill, but he kept his gaze fixed on Max, his body tense like a bow ready to snap. The minutes stretched. A roar still echoed in the treetops. Leo was frozen, his muscles tense, his gaze unyielding. Help arrived. Max was sedated and taken away. David was cared for and placed on a stretcher before being loaded into the ambulance. He extended his bloody hand to Leo and whispered, "Thank you, Leo, thank you, my son." David stayed in the hospital for a week. His injuries were serious, a deep bite, numerous cuts, and broken ribs. But what hurt him the most was imagining what could have happened without Leo. During his recovery, he received hundreds of messages, letters, and calls from people touched by what they had learned. Many offered to help with donations, psychological support, and companionship. Some even sent letters from abroad, moved by the story of this old man and his lion. A little girl from Denmark sent a lion-shaped charm. A retiree from Brazil offered to share his pension to support the shelter. David was touched but only asked for one thing, to go home. He wanted to see Leo, hug him, and find his home. When he returned, Leo was waiting for him at the edge of the garden. He didn't run to him, didn't roar. He simply looked at him with a gaze that said it all. When they came face to face, the lion lay down. David, despite the pain, knelt beside him and cried into his friend's golden mane. "You saved my life again. I no longer have the slightest doubt. You are not an animal. You are an angel with claws." Life after the attack was never the same again, not because of fear, but because from that day on, David and Leo ceased to be simply a man and a lion. They became a symbol, a message, a living testimony to the love that saves. Visitors from further and further afield came after hearing their story. Some brought gifts for Leo, others wrote poems. A Spanish child painted a picture of Leo carrying a son on his back. A young Italian artist began a mural depicting Leo and David in an embrace. David's arm remained scarred. He moved with difficulty. The scars remained invisible. A trembling persisted, but he simply said, "I am alive, and that's what matters." Leo had also changed. He was no longer the playful lion of before. His movements were slower. His gaze observed the world as if he had unlocked its secrets. During the silent hours, David sat beside him without saying a word. They breathed together, sharing the moment. Sometimes only the buzzing of insects and the peaceful breathing of the lion could be heard. It was a new form of presence, silent but full of meaning. One afternoon, as the warm wind slid through the fig leaves, David wrote in his old notebook, "If a lion can love, then no one is lost." It wasn't a phrase for others. It was a reminder for himself that redemption is possible even when you no longer believe in it. Summer passed, and with it, everything changed once again. David knew that time is a silent thief, especially when you share it with someone you love. Leo, once fiery and full of strength, slowed down. His movements had become more measured, his muscles less tense, his breathing deeper and heavier. David watched him with the silent sadness of a father who knows his child will one day leave him. Leo now spent long hours under the large fig tree in the garden, the tree that David had once planted with his wife. Its branches provided shade. Its leaves whispered in the wind. There, in the warm dust, Leo slept. The children still came, the adults too, but the roles had changed. Leo was no longer the playful companion but a wise guardian. He looked people straight in the eye, and sometimes it seemed he saw beyond them into something deeper. David was proud but also silently worried. David took care of him with dedication. He bathed him in warm water, laid down towels, hummed. When the sun was too strong, he prepared special food for him and spoke to him as if he were an old friend. "You have given me so much," he said one evening, stroking his forehead. "If one day you leave, don't take everything with you. Leave me a little of your courage." News of Leo's condition spread. People came to see him one last time. They brought letters, drawings, and flowers. Some wept silently. Others simply knelt beside him. An old soldier placed his medal on the ground near Leo and said, "I know what camaraderie means. You are more than an animal." A boy who had lost his father took Leo's paw and said softly, "Thank you for staying." David was grateful for every gesture, but he was also protective. Not everyone could approach him. He wanted neither spectacle nor cameras, just silence, just true presence. A sign at the entrance bore a single word, respect. One morning, the sky was orange and mild. David took his cup of coffee as he did every day and left, but Leo. One morning, the sky was orange and mild. David took his cup of coffee as he did every day and went outside, but Leo wasn't in his usual spot. David searched without fear. He knew where he would find him, under the fig tree at dawn. Leo was lying down, his eyes closed, his breathing almost silent. David sat down beside him. He put a hand on his friend's broad chest. Minutes passed. The lion slowly opened his eyes, looked at him one last time, and rested his head on David's leg before closing his eyes forever. It was like the world was holding its breath. The animals in the shelter stayed quiet. No wind blew. Only the tiny clink of the coffee cup that David placed on the ground. He didn't cry right away. He just sat there, stroking Leo's mane, and whispered, "Thank you for coming here with me." The next few days were quiet. People came with candles, songs, and stories of what Leo had meant to them. A little girl said, "I've learned not to be afraid anymore." An old man said, "I had forgotten what kindness was until I saw him." A young woman, once very sick, shared how she had found hope again because of Leo. Each of their stories showed that this lion had given something that went beyond words. David didn't want it to stop there. He built a small memorial under the fig tree, a circle of stones surrounded by wildflowers with a bronze plaque of Leo, the lion who healed people's hearts, a handprint of David, and a copy of Leo's big paw print. In the middle, it wasn't a grave, it was a place of peace and silence. With help from donations, volunteers, and some past visitors, he turned the property into an official refuge not just for animals, but also for people, blind horses, herd dogs, and children who had been burned in fires, along with sick children and lonely elderly folks. No one was turned away. No one was invisible. Everyone brought something, a story, a scar, or a need for comfort. At the heart of the sanctuary, Leo's memory stayed, not as a story, but as the truth. David often held small, quiet ceremonies where visitors would pass by slowly in silence. Under the fig tree, he'd often say. Here, a lion learned how to love, and that's enough. When people left, they'd usually leave a small stone as a sign that they understood something deeper than words. The years moved slower than before. David was getting older, but his eyes stayed clear. When people asked if he'd ever feel that kind of bond again, he'd say, "No, but once is enough. Once can change everything." And in the evening, when the sun set and the wind rustled the leaves of the fig tree, sometimes he thought he heard a roar far away. Or maybe it was just a memory. Or maybe, just maybe, it was love. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Drop a comment telling us what moved you most, and help us spread this incredible tale of love and courage.